welcome everyone to our very first Exited Entrepreneurs in Residence conversation. This on the record, off the record series with Exited Entrepreneurs comes from a couple of trends that we noticed in the pack. One was that startups who are creating new products inevitably do not separate product strategy and development from fundraising. And it's important to have an eye toward what the ultimate objective is for the startup in terms of fundraising and financing. And no one is better for providing those insights than exited entrepreneurs. And then also in talking with other people about PAC and meeting Sharon and Shama and a couple other entrepreneurs, realize that some of the most interesting insights come from the off the record conversations, the conversations that you do not see on LinkedIn or on YouTube or any of the podcasts. So we wanted to create this space so that people can talk about what's going on in the startup space, how to successfully scale and exit your startup, and of course, gaining the insights from women who've been there and done that. So I'll just turn it over to Sharon and Shama. We have a couple questions for them to answer. And the first question is really just, how did you become an entrepreneur? What is your startup story?
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you. So I became an entrepreneur by accident somewhat. I was working in consulting. I did a lot of random career shifts in my 30s. And I was working in consulting for big tech companies around marketing strategy, particularly events where they were trying to attract C-level or senior VP level people. So I just kept seeing the same problem come up over and over, which is that salespeople did not know how to talk to this level of person. And I started creating these dossiers to prep sales and marketing teams to speak business speak with those folks. And so long story short, I actually turned it into a database and built a software layer over the top that would allow customers to create groups of, say, 50 people that they were really trying to attract and understand what those 50 people had in common so they could design an experience or a message to target that exact group of people versus a persona, which is more generic. So I built a product. I had no experience building products, but I built a product that I knew the customers would love and started a company around it and, didn't really expect that it would go anywhere, but it just kept going and growing. And I sold it in early 2022 to a public British company called Altrata. The name of my company was Boardroom Insiders. And so I really was learning on the job as an entrepreneur. I'm not, a Stanford trained, or I didn't go through any kind of college university entrepreneurship program. It was just on the job training.
Like Sharon, I also kind of got into this whole journey quite via accident. Basically, I had been working in tech for a very long time. I started off as an engineer and then, grew into product organically, had done both enterprise as well as consumer tech. And I had this idea, about this turning food delivery on its head. And I pitched it to my co-founder, who happened to be my husband. And he basically had been a serial entrepreneur before. And he took it to some VCs. They loved the idea and they were ready to kind of pitch in like right off the bat, even before the product was ready or had gone to market or even just to fund the prototype. They were very willing to do so. And the whole idea was, I thought he's just going to run with it and I'm just going to go and find my next gig and, just continue working in the corporate world. But it so happens that he kind of cornered me into staying. He said, like, I need your help, with building product as well as building the team. I had worked at Palm before in some other companies, and those engineers, maybe they saw something which I didn't in myself, where they kind of said, anytime you do a startup, we'll come and join you, right? And it so happened that there was a team that was willing to work with us. And so I recruited the team. I built the first prototype and I took it to market. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to I'm done. I've delivered version 1.0 and I'm now going to go find have my own life. But the VCs at that time, we had just raised a Series A and they were like, no, we need you to stay. So, I ended up staying and grew the team. And, I wouldn't trade it for the world though. It was an awesome journey. So that's how I kind of, half accident, half being conned and half wanted to stay.
Those are both really great stories. And I also love how they're so different too. I mean, there's commonalities to differences. So Sharon, you grew your startup organically and really bootstrapped it. And it was a combination of consulting, systematizing the solution. Wondering if you could share more about that and, what your financing journey was like, whatever you want to share on the record.
So one thing I don't think we've even talked about this. I did have a startup in 2000.
Oh,
and I raised money for that one. And after that, I decided I never wanted to raise money again because in April 2000, everything was crashing. It was the .com crash. And somehow I managed to raise $3 million right in the middle of that in April 2000 from an incubator, which means they take 51%. That did not go well. Basically what happened, without getting too much into that story, once they realized this is going to be a prolonged crash, they reneged and pulled our funding and tried to sue us for fraud. They were not successful. They just didn't want to fund us, because everything was crashing. So we got really screwed. And so when I started this startup in 2008, I said, I'm not going to ever do that again. Right. But then the reality hit me like, well, I need money. And I was already consulting on the side. So I was working on all these things at once. And I did know somebody who had a really nice exit, and he was a friend of mine. I talked to him about what I was doing, and he said, I'll write you a check for $125,000 so you can get started. So I took this friend's money, someone I trusted and who's been a huge mentor to me. And I was determined I was never going to raise money from, VC money or from somebody I didn't know. And so fortunately, we were able to just self-fund and grow through revenue. It was slower than we would have liked. And there were times in our growth where we wanted to tackle something and we couldn't afford it. And so we started toying with the idea of fundraising, and we had a few conversations, but it became pretty clear that no one was going to fund us because they didn't think we were scalable. They didn't understand our business. And it was very frustrating because we already had Cisco Systems paying us. We had HP paying us. We had DXC paying us. Some of the biggest technology companies in the world were paying us for our service and our product, and we still couldn't raise funding. So at a certain point, we just said, screw it. And at a certain point, you get big enough where you're like, why would I give up any equity now? We're kind of on the cusp of being very, very stable. And at a certain point, it's like a flywheel with the type of SaaS product that we built. You start throwing off a bunch of cash because you reach this critical mass, and each new customer is just that much more profitable. So then we just said, well, we're not going to ever fundraise. Now, we probably grew a lot slower than we could have otherwise. Or maybe not, I don't really know, but that's just what our circumstances were. And by the way, the guy who put in 125, he made more than 2 million. So it didn't work out too badly for him.
Thanks for sharing all that. That's a great story. Shama, what about you?
Yeah. So I was kind of very different from Sharon, quite the opposite actually. So, my co-founder, like I said, had been a serial entrepreneur. So when I pitched him this idea, he just had lunch with one of the VCs. They were super interested in this, take on food delivery because it was basically, it just made more unit economic sense. It was peer-to-peer rather than standing up your own driver. So it just was a very unique concept. And so when he took it, they were more than eager to, put in the funding as long as we stood a team up for just prototyping and taking it and seeing if there's product market fit, which we did. And then, once we gained product market fit, they put in some more money. And then as we scaled up to, we went to college campuses. So as we scaled up to 1 or 2 college campuses, then we were able to very successfully raise a Series A right after that. So yeah, I think it wasn't that painful of a process for us initially. I think it was more of a pain later down the road, and especially when we were trying to raise money during COVID, that was not pleasant. That was a Series B, and that was not really very pleasant given that the markets had crashed. So, but luckily we had an exit on our way, and we were bought by Walmart. So that's what happened. And it was a good exit, but we would have loved to have a Series B, but that did not happen.
I'm curious, when you compare pre-COVID and during COVID, when you say it was, I guess, easy, was it that were you essentially setting your own milestones, your own OKRs, and then, telling investors, or were they setting the terms? My experience is that, there's kind of this unofficial alignment or agreement about investors as markets evolve, and like what startups should be driving toward. So I'm curious if you were kind of setting the terms, or if they were setting, kind of the milestones.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were setting the terms for the most part of how we run the business and what a healthy business meant for us, right? So they wanted us to grow at a certain pace, so they were willing to put in more money and like have us burn cash. We were a little bit, in fact, we were a bit more conservative than they wanted us to be, because we having done a few startups before and knowing the value of cash, and plus we didn't want to take more and more. It was not a game for us. We really wanted to take a few markets to profit and then raise the next valid round, right? Because it's better valuation, just more healthy. Unfortunately, that kind of backfired for us because our markets were primarily college campuses and offices. And so when we were in the midst of raising a Series B during COVID, our markets had dried out. So we didn't have markets to show for. It was just really bad timing for us, right? Though there was a big, huge spike in money flowing in for other companies, right? There was that was when everybody kind of went black, right, on the crypto and all the other things that you had. But we were unfortunately the other side of that thing, given our markets had dried out. So at that point, when there was some squeeze on profitability, and that's when the kind of the VCs got more involved, a little bit more involved. But I wouldn't say that. I think we had good VCs. They let us pretty much run our own business. They trusted us, and because we had shown a lot of financial responsibility. So I don't think that was a concern from them.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Hearing you talk about it reminds me, just all of the ambiguity and uncertainty that startups have to navigate. And I don't know anyone who has the answer, but I'll ask the question anyways. What do you think startup leadership teams could do to try to de-risk these situations from happening, in which suddenly you said your customers, you didn't really have paying customers anymore, or like nobody really can take into account all of the doomsday scenarios that could happen, like a COVID. But is there anything that comes to mind for either of you, really, as far as what can be done to, move forward, yet also consider these risks?
I don't feel like I have a brilliant answer or anything. I mean, you just can't anticipate everything that could happen, but I think you can be resilient by running your business. I always think, especially when you don't have funding, I was always on a tightrope, right? And on one side is the risk that you're not giving your business enough fuel to grow. And on the other side is you are over investing in things too early. And so I think the talent of a great bootstrapper is the ability to just stay perfectly on that rope and not fall off one side or the other. And what that means is you have to be creative, because for example, I would never invest in something unless I was feeling some kind of significant pain. And that doesn't include something that's visible to the customer. You never want it to be visible to the customer. It was usually coming at me, the pain. So, for example, when we developed our product, second generation of our product, we worked with a development firm and I managed the development firm personally. And I did all the oversight of product testing and I found the bugs that they didn't find. And this is not something that I like doing or I'm particularly good at, but I didn't have anyone to do it. So that was really painful. And then, so when we got to the second round of, our next product enhancements, I had a guy on my editorial team who was in the process of earning a master's in, I don't even remember, data analysis from Georgia Tech. He was doing it online while he was working for us. And I noticed that he just was so fascinated with our product, even though his particular job had nothing to do with that customer facing product. He was like doing back end content stuff. And we agreed that he was kind of overqualified for his job, but he had just wanted to get an in with the company. And so I had hired him into this role. And so I thought about it and I said, "Hey, Gordon, what do you think about moving into a hybrid role? You've found bugs in our product. You're obviously interested in it. Has nothing to do with your job, but you're always going in there and looking at it." I said, "What if I put you in a hybrid role, half-time product testing and management, half-time in your current role? We'll see how it goes. And it works out for both of us. You'll get promoted. You'll get a big raise in, 6 months." So that's what we did. And he did a great job and he ended up being our product manager. So that was a great example of, I had this pain. I knew I needed someone to do this that was not me. I didn't have the time or confidence to go externally. And if I had hired someone who had a bunch of product management experience, they would have been coming in and they would have taken 6 months to get up to speed on our product, right? Gordon was already in there all the time. He loved it. He was fascinated. I wasn't really sure if he had the skills, but I thought, I think he can learn it. And he did. And it worked out beautifully. And I actually did the same thing with recruiting HR with another person from the same department. I kept stealing this department's people and putting them in hybrid and then permanent roles. But it worked out really, really well. And it just was so low risk in terms of, I don't want to take on a new headcount that's unproven. So if you can do creative things like that, I believe you can make your business resilient and able to weather those things and allow people to wear multiple hats. And by the way, it's also very rewarding for people to be given a new opportunity, even though they don't have that background, and it helps you retain them.
Yeah. I think, Sharon, you brought up perfect points. So I was going to say, hire a great team. And when I mean a great team is, though you hire for specific positions, hire people who have a great attitude and who are great critical thinkers, who can then, as Sharon said, pick up multiple things and roll with them, right? And we did that too. I was the first PM on this role. I was the first customer support manager. I did all these roles, and then all these roles had to be filled in with people. And we did exactly what Sharon said. We picked people who were under me and then kind of cross-trained them. So what happens is that at any given point, because you've cross-trained people and these people now know end-to-end systems and into how the company runs end-to-end, you can do more with less, right? So that's the second thing is do more with less. That's the culture that we set, right? And it's not like, squeezing people out. It's just kind of, I think it motivates, to Sharon's point, when you elevate people from within, right? And you give them more to do. And again, be creative. So once you hire the right team, you can be more creative. You can do more with less. You can, you can really stretch your dollar. I think that's extremely important. And the third thing that I would say is be resourceful. Again, it's coming from the second point. Conserve your cash. Don't burn it. And this whole thing about growth at all costs has to be like a little bit of a balancing situation. You have to be very thoughtful on what kind of growth you want, right? Do you want just people coming in through acquisition and not kind of retaining? Like which metric do you measure? We have to be very thoughtful very, very thoughtful to those metrics. And then lastly, I think listen to your intuition. I think we knew that the college market, though great for us, had natural churn. Kids were graduating after 4 years. They go out, they go off on summer vacation and stuff. And our intuition initially was to quickly go into into offices, but we did that a year too late. The board was like, grow the college campuses. You guys are doing fantastically. We were also on the board, so it's not only the VCs. It was all of us collectively. So I think kind of listen to your gut. I think sometimes that really is correct. So that's what I would say.
That's great. Those are great points about like talent as key for managing the risk.
Yeah, I don't really, and again, like I can't agree more with Sharon. Like growing people from within, they understand you, they're interested, they're vested, they are motivated. Train them, even if they don't have experience. Train them. The main thing that they should have in copious amounts is critical thinking and empathy. And I think with those two qualities, you can train anyone to pretty much launch right. But that's my yeah. So I kind of I'm all very wary of the fact that people bring in these execs and into startups where they just don't know what to do sometimes. So.
Well, I find it particularly interesting because at Fox, we're all about really clarifying what product leaders' strengths are and curating matches with the right startup, the right innovator, the right time for the right product. And so what comes to mind for me is how would you recommend other startups or other innovators assess talent? Because I think and when you say critical thinking skills, who's evaluating for that? I mean, I just mean in general. I don't know that anyone is. Like how would you look for that?
We didn't do this for every role we hired for, but for our largest team, I had a test that I would give during the interview process, and I would pay the people to do it because I don't believe in asking people to do anything for free. And I would set them up for success. We put together a packet of information that showed them how to approach the task. And we also provided them some research materials that are from a paid source. We didn't want to have to go out and pay for that. So we gave them a packet. We asked them to do this test. And it was really important for us because our editorial team needed to have really strong business acumen. And I would describe to people what that meant during the interview process, but that didn't mean they had it. And you would have business journalists who had been working for 10 years who would fail the test. And then you'd have a Montessori school teacher who would ace the test. You never knew who was going to do well. And, what it really came down to, I figured out over the years, people who did the best were people whose parents were senior level executives. And so, don't ever let anyone tell you that your background doesn't matter or give you an edge. They absolutely had an edge because they grew up talking about business at the dinner table. And also, people who worked really hard on the test did well and who learned on their feet quickly. But we did this because we wanted to give the candidates a sense of exactly what the work was, because it was pretty tedious, heads down work. And we didn't want anyone to come in not understanding what the work was. So from their perspective, it gave them a sense of what the work was. It gave us a sense of, if this person had the baseline level of business acumen we needed. And we could do a ton of training, but they needed to start with some baseline. And that worked beautifully for us. We never had a bad hire in that department.
We did something very similar to what Sharon did. When we had product managers, we would, so we obviously for every role, we had different way we interviewed. For product managers, we used to give them a case study and, not just have, just your standard, what's your strength, what's your weakness kind of questions, because that doesn't get you much in a startup, in startup plan. So we really wanted them to dig deep, and we would give them around a week to, to work on this case, which is most most likely a real life thing that we were seeing, right? And then we would give that, and also kind of give, like just, design a product feature, or, how would they kind of go about solving that problem from a product sense, but also then add in like, go to market, and like how would they do that, and how they think about end to end, right? And so that was something that we did like quite well. For engineers, of course, we had like lead coding and, like all the, the coding platforms. And so we, again, the trick for front end and back end was that we wanted people just either interview for front end, or people interview for back end. But we were like, we emphasized on systems thinking. So even if we were hiring a front end engineer, we wanted to make sure that they understood the whole end to end architecture, and they kind of really, knew how to kind of delve into the details if they needed to, right? And then when people came on board, whether it was engineering or product or whoever, we made them, it was required for them to do customer support for 2 weeks to get started, so that they understood the customer, they understood the product, they understood the system, and they understood the pain points of what everybody was going through. So
I
That's
like
amazing.
both of those answers. Yeah. And especially with the requirement for customer service. I think that's smart.
I mean, there's so many engineers who came back and said, let's solve, because yes, and it wasn't only customers. We used to also make them do runs. So we would have them, go out and deliver stuff, right? Because it was a peer-to-peer thing, so we could. And then so many engineers came back, and they were like, even if they were in denial of, of a bug to be solved, when we send them out and they hit that bug as the customer, they, no questions asked, they fixed it. So it was like, making them feel their own pain sometimes.